Nirvana exploded onto a music scene that had no mind, no depth and no substance. A young audience sick to the teeth of formulaic pop and sugar-coated rock were quickly seduced by the dark and dangerous Angry Band, hailing from Nowheresville, USA. Their enigmatic frontman Kurt Cobain became the king of the disaffected youth, with an ability to capture the feelings of millions who felt in some way or other like outsiders. He saw frailty and vulnerability, wrote about cruelty and despair. A decade has passed since Kurt took his own life. Whilst many people still revere him as an important figure who changed the face of rock and roll, there are some who feel his anarchic brand of music was merely an antidote to the big hair bands of the day. Nirvana were in the right place at the right time. 10 years on, does Kurt deserve his place amongst the seminal figures of rock music? Or was he just a self-obsessed loser who at the height of his fame threw it all away? On the 10th anniversary of Kurt's death, a photo shrine was erected outside a Virgin megastore in central London. Fans were invited to leave their written messages as a tribute to Kurt's memory. But not all the sentiments were positive. Amongst the messages of love and admiration, someone had defaced the giant photo of Kurt with the words Muppet and Boo-hoo. In a press interview, another onlooker stated, "I don't know what all the fuss is about. Kurt Cobain was nothing more than a drugged-up loser who only wrote one decent tune." On that same 10th anniversary, Courtney commemorated Kurt's death in her own personal way.
This is a guy who kind of gloried in things not being right and kind of never really appeared to want to look at the upside of anything, because if you look for the upside of anything, you might get disappointed. So it's far easier to always look on the dark side of things. He was a multi-millionaire, had a wife who appeared to be tremendously in love with and a baby daughter, and could have done anything at all, and yet he chose not to do that.
How should Kurt Cobain be remembered? As somebody who sold a lot less records and had a lot less hits than the guy out of Chicago, do you remember them? If You Leave Me Now, who also, in a fit of pique, blew his own brains out.
The fact that we're talking about Kurt Cobain's music 10 years after the guy died explains a lot. It tells us that his music meant something, and it still means something, and we're still trying to get to the bottom of what that music meant. That music is still being heard, and we're still trying to fathom it out.
There's never a day goes by where I don't think about him, and there's never a day goes by where I don't talk about him.
We know he was great because we miss him, and we're still talking about him.
But his music mattered to him a lot, and I hope that people see that it was really so much about the music for him.
I go to gigs now and I see kids wearing Nirvana t-shirts and stuff. Some of those people were barely born when Nirvana were making their music.
I remember once being up in Sheffield with Steve O'Mac, funny enough, and he was DJing, and he's like, watch this, he puts Teen Spirit on, boom. It was just pandemonium, it was chaos. This is like 5 to 6, 7 years after the death.
In 1991, Kurt wrote a song that was to change the face of rock and roll. It was the now legendary rock anthem Smells Like Teen Spirit, a track that literally overnight catapulted Nirvana from nowhere to rock superstardom.
Obviously Smells Like Teen Spirit was a song that propelled them to huge success, huge fame. A song that is still in the ether now. We can still hear that song all the time.
We were just all amazed at how quickly it became so big. It went from being played, a couple times a day to being played, once an hour or more on the radio and singing on MTV. Everyone else sees them as rock stars, and they're like, oh, Kurt Cobain, but you're like, well, he was a friend, It's very strange.
Teen Spirit holds up against pretty much any piece of popular rock music that you're ever going to hear. It's very exciting. It's a great punk rock song.
You could tell, then you'd go into Teen Spirit, and when we were on tour and we'd see it on MTV, and we'd call someone else's room, you know, it's hard.
I was quite surprised that the reaction was so intense and so immediate with that particular single. You felt like the world of music was changing right there in front of you, and I think to a degree it was.
The momentum and excitement at the time was so great because everyone sensed that the album was going to do pretty well, you know. There was just a feeling in the air, you know, there was just like this new thing happening and no one could quite pinpoint it, but we knew that we were a part of it, you know.
As soon as Teen Spirit was issued, 2 weeks before Nevermind, and then Nevermind came out, and then they went on this club tour, all of a sudden, he was everywhere. It's really one of the remarkable things. It is comparable to Beatlemania in the sense that one day, most people in America don't know a damn thing about him. The next day, everyone is asking themselves, who is this guy?
He recorded Teen Spirit and that album, Nevermind, and before it came out, he went back to Seattle. He'd been evicted from his flat and he lived in his car. So between the time that album was made and the time it came out, he was living in a car. That's how poor he was, that's how real it was at that time.
In 1990, I think, applied for a job cleaning shit out of a dog kennel, and he didn't get the job. That shows how desperate, in a way, that he was, and the other members of Nirvana were no better. They were living in fairly, you know, unprepossessing circumstances. That's, you know, they regarded, for them, from a depressed working class background that they came from, rock and roll was a career option in a sense. It was an escape.
So it really connected, I think. It was a proper form of music that meant something to a new generation of people.
Kurt was born in 1967 in the isolated, depressing logging town of Aberdeen, Washington. Since the decline of logging, Aberdeen had become a virtual ghost town, with boarded-up stores and run-down bars amidst a handful of pawn shops overflowing with guns, chainsaws and electric guitars. Kurt had, by his own admission, a relatively happy childhood until the age of 8 when his parents divorced. He claimed the acrimonious traumatic split fueled the angst in much of his early lyrics.
He discussed his childhood with me quite a bit, actually. He talked about how he had a pretty happy childhood until his parents got divorced, and then after that he just was pretty much miserable. You know, he lived with his dad and his stepmom for a while, and he felt like his dad wanted him to be a jock and all the things that he couldn't do, didn't want to do.
He was taking wrestling in school. Him and his dad weren't getting along, and his dad went to one of the wrestling matches, and Kurt just relaxed and let the guy throw him all over the place, wouldn't fight back. His dad got mad and embarrassed him, and he done it just on account of his dad, and his dad walked out on him.
They once took me to where they came from, Aberdeen, and it was like going back 20 years. It used to be a thriving logging community, and then as soon as the logging was taken away, it was just a ghost town. And every house looked like it was housing a closet serial killer or something. And they were telling you all these like weird, macabre stories about Aberdeen.
At home he feels like a tourist. At home he feels like a tourist. He fills his head with culture. He gives himself an ulcer. He fills his head with culture. He gives himself an ulcer.
I was surprised by the level of poverty and despair that he had growing up. Kurt wrote the song about living under the bridge and told that story, which I found out was mythical. He didn't really live under the bridge, but the true story was even sadder.
Underneath the bridge, top is sprung on a leak, and
He was homeless for a time, and he broke into houses that were being built and slept there. He would go into the hospital that he had been born in, and he would sleep in the waiting room because he wanted a warm place to sleep. And he figured if he was in a hospital, nobody would come up and say, "Why are you here?" What a horrible, sad existence that his life had led to that point.
Well, I think his childhood shaped him quite a bit. I think he probably always wanted to be accepted by someone close to him, since he didn't really feel accepted by his mother or his father. And I think that's part of the reason maybe why he sought fame. But it's kind of hard to say. I think he had a hard time maybe in relationships. He wanted to get close to people and be loved, but at the same time he had a hard time maybe accepting that he was loved.
In 1987, Kurt teamed up with school friend Chris Novoselic, who was impressed by an early demo tape of Kurt's first band, Fecal Matter. After a few jams and a name change, Nirvana was born. They completed the early lineup with drummer Chad Channing.
I first met Kurt at a show in Tacoma, this place called the Tacoma World Theater, and that was actually in '87. They were looking for a drummer, and they said, "Hey, we're